It was a momentous incident. Even though there wasn't any damage done, the target was not a high value target. It was the first time that NATO has directly attacked Russia. That's what the Russians have been pointing out all the time. It just doesn't seem to filter through in the Western media. They just never talk about this because they don't never pay any attention to what the Russians are saying. But the Russians have been saying this repeatedly, and nobody has denied it. And in fact, some important Western officials have admitted that what the Russians are saying is true. But it doesn't seem to ever get into the Western media coverage of this. So somebody who's just consuming the establishment Western media would think that, for some reason the West was imposing very unreasonable restrictions on the use of these missiles. They were giving these missiles to the Ukrainians, but not letting them use it. Meanwhile, the Russians are firing missiles into their territory, right. and when you look at it in that way, you say, yeah, why not? They should be able to fight back, right?
Right. Let Ukraine strike back. That's what I keep seeing online.
Yeah, right. And to that extent, but the problem is that it's not the Ukrainians. These missiles have to be fired with direct NATO participation. We have to have, again, NATO technicians inputting the data, programming it. And that makes all the difference. And that's why this is a very alarming incident. And we'll have to see what the Russians, how they're going to respond. Now, there's been, I think, quite a bit of a very strong response within the Russian media. So, they have said, yeah, NATO is now, these are kind of the blaring headlines. These are the lead stories on the news shows. So the Russians, understand what's going on. And undoubtedly there's going to be pressure on Putin to respond. And Putin himself has made it real clear that this is serious. He's repeated this several times, as have other very high-ranking Russian officials. So it seems like likely, even though there was basically no damage done, if the Russian version is right, it seems likely that there will be some kind of response. Now, it'll be proportionate, since they didn't attack the Kremlin or something. They're not going to go ahead and attack the White House. It could be, as we said, maybe they'll give some missiles to the Houthis. Maybe they'll strike an ammunition depot somewhere in Romania or Poland.
Do you think they would do that?
For tat. They might. I just don't know. But that would be a tit for tat response, right?
Right, but yeah. I think Putin knows that if he does that, then that's what almost I think a lot of the people in charge in the West want. They want to be able to enact Article 5. That's what Zelensky wants.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you can't, if it's Article 5 is, well, first of all, the members of NATO have to vote on it. It's not something automatic. And second, it is about an unprovoked attack.
Right.
But if NATO or a NATO country goes ahead and attacks Russia and then Russia responds, Article 5 should not be relevant in that case. Of course, they can always spin things and pretend. But, it's a difficult situation for Putin because, yeah, this is actually quite minor. He doesn't want to escalate. Yet, the thing is that the U.S. keeps on escalating. It's just sort of like the situation Iran is in the Middle East. We don't want to have a war. But if we don't respond at some point, they'll just keep on going up the escalation ladder. It's going to get worse and worse. So at some point, we just have to respond. And, I'm sure that, I'm not sure, again, because it was a very minor incident, apparently. And it was also carried out under a lame duck administration. Biden's on his way out. And Trump it seems from things that he said and other people around him said that they will probably put an end to this policy when Trump takes office. So, given that situation, especially if Trump contacts or, the Trump team contacts the Russian government directly and says, hey, we're going to, when we take office, when we're in charge, this won't happen. I'm sorry, this is happening now. It may be enough for the Russians just to ignore it as long as there's no, significant damage. We'll see.
Or if we may just continue to escalate. I mean, we did this quick. The news that the U.S. gave permission, and then within 24 hours, They did
Right.
it. They had it all
Yeah.
lined up, ready to go.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, so
And then I actually heard just 2 hours ago, 12. This is the news story that 12 Storm Shadow missiles were fired at a village in Kursk, in the Kursk region.
oh really?
And then,
Okay.
yeah, according to the Russians, all 12 were intercepted. And you can even see there's a video of some guy, in Kursk, just he's filming these storm shadows flying over one after another.
Yeah. Well, an exciting time for people living in Kursk. It sounds like a pretty boring place until recently. So,
Right.
what is does most of the world view it the way that we see it, or the way the Russians see it? That this is NATO attacking Russia, or do
I think most of the
people
world views it that way. Yeah, I mean, it's in the West. We live in this bubble, where we are just hidden really from the truth. I go and I look at the mainstream news feed every day, and it's basically just Ukrainian propaganda. It's just spoon-fed to the Western media, and then they regurgitate it. That's all it is. And they never listen to what the Russians say, because that would be, collaborating with the enemy or something. But it's, what kind of news coverage is that? You gotta, what are the Russians saying? It's very important. And of course, the Russians have been saying that this would be a direct attack because, this cannot be done by the Ukrainians on their own. That's a huge point. Well, if you're a true, responsible Western journalist, you should look into that. But none of them do. None of them even bother to hear what the Russians have to say. If they look into it, they would see that their own people, like Olaf Scholz, those German generals, just to give one example, the ones that were caught on that on that tape discussing the use of the Taurus missiles on the Kerch Bridge, they said openly that, we can't do this, by ourselves. That NATO has to fire these missiles.
Okay, so most of the world, you think, is aware of that this is a NATO attack
I
on
think
Russia.
so. I think so. I think that's how most of the world looks at it.
Right, but I think
And that's kind of, like much of the world, especially the global South, has kind of become increasingly pro-Russian because, they look at NATO as sort of the, alliance of the colonial powers.
right.
And so they kind of naturally find themselves rooting for Russia, for Russia is the one country that can take them on.
Right. Well, I think it's more important what the people in these Western countries, within NATO countries, believe. But
Yeah.
I think that within the NATO countries, most of them believe that this is just Ukraine now having the ability to strike back. That these were restrictions that should have been lifted a long time ago.
Yeah,
is that true?
Because that's they never get they never hear the other side of the story. They never hear the essential fact, the Russian argument, which again is supported, very powerfully by the evidence. In fact, nobody's really denying it on the Western side, but
Right.
that information is suppressed. So most Western Europeans just don't understand.
Right.
Now,
So
quite a few Western governments actually are against this policies, or some important ones are, like Germany has come out. Olaf Scholz once again came out and said, we don't support this. We think this is a mistake. And apparently Meloni of Italy also said the same thing just the other day.
Right. But the issue is that if people in the NATO countries, they don't believe that this is really a NATO attack on Russia. If Russia does strike, let's say, like you said, did a tit for tat, struck a base in Romania, then people will say that this is an unprovoked attack, that this is an aggression. It will be easier to push Article 5 through.
It's easier, but I think it's also going to be, I don't think there's a real appetite for, direct war with Russia. I think it's just the foolishness. Again, it's just these idiots, they're just not looking at the consequences, and they feel like they can get away with anything. Again, it seems like a lot of these Western leaders have made the assumption that Russia today is essentially Russia of the 1990s, and just won't dare to take us on. I mean, this is the kind of thinking that they've had all along, and it's really what's gotten them into such big trouble. I think, first of all, they basically tore up the Minsk agreements. It's ignored it. It just, Russia's been, before the invasion in 2022, Russia was continually ringing the alarm bells and saying, "Hey, we got a real problem here. We got to solve this." And they just blew them off, right? And then ended up with a war on their hands. But they still really have not learned. It seems like this is still their idea, is that basically, because when they talk about, for example, when Western media talks about some sort of ceasefire, it's clear that they never bothered to talk to look at what the Russian demands are. They just kind of figure that we can impose a ceasefire on them. They'll just have to accept. They'll be happy, which is just nonsense. They don't understand, that Russia is a sovereign power and is actually more powerful than they are on the battlefield. I don't think they really get it yet.
Right.
So they're just thinking we can do this. First of all, they're idiots. They think that this actually is going to make a difference. And, it'll have no effect on the outcome, which again, actually, like the Pentagon has been saying, is still saying. They imagine that it really could have an effect, just like every other system. Think about the F-16s. We mentioned, these missiles, but then, there was a huge, hullabaloo about the F-16s. There were cries and says, we got to bring in the F-16. That'll turn things around. Well, they were delivered some months ago. And what have you heard about F-16s?
Right.
Nothing, right? We know at least one, probably more, but at least one either crashed, that's what the Ukrainians said, or was shot down.
Shot down by, I think you said that, potentially by our own Patriot interceptor.
Yeah, well, that's a possibility. There are different stories. There are different versions. And then there's also reason to believe that some other F-16s were actually destroyed on the ground. But in any case, we're just not seeing F-16s. We don't hear about them. Obviously, they're just not having, if there are any F-16s left, they're not having an impact, just like all these other systems.